That year, the city of Harrisville decided to revive a nearly forgotten civic holiday, National Unity Day. The town council, eager to unite a community divided by years of economic downturn and quiet tension, announced a grand celebration. A parade route was drawn to wind through the city's main boulevard and end at the large municipal park, where speeches, songs, and booths would greet the gathered families. It was all meant to foster togetherness, a symbol that the city had not forgotten how to hope. The parade organizers had little reason to consider the far northeastern corner of the park. Most people never walked there anymore. The ground sloped unevenly, and the trees grew dense, casting long shadows that made it feel forgotten even in daylight. But that forgotten corner was precisely where the path would pass, a necessary bend to make room for the music stage and vendor tents being set up near the pond. They called it Memory Walk on old maps, though few remembered the name. To most, it was just a place where the city failed to keep up the landscaping. But to one man, it was the only part of Harrisville that had not changed in 40 years. Before the sun could burn the fog off the grass that morning, Harold Mason stood where he always stood, in silence, with a rusted bucket in one hand and a cloth in the other. His boots, the same he had worn through decades of Ohio winters, sunk slightly into the damp earth. He carried no camera, no phone, no watch. Only the weight of memory. One by one, he approached the worn markers. The marble had faded, chipped by time and weather. Most bore no visitors. The families had moved or disappeared. But Harold knew each name, each rank. He had whispered them for years. He remembered how they spoke, how they walked, how they fell. He knelt by the second stone, laying the cloth flat. With slow, deliberate strokes, he cleared away a layer of green. Underneath, the faint letters became visible: CPL, David M., Rowan, Kia 1989. Harold paused, eyes closed. He stayed that way for several seconds, as if waiting for something unspoken to pass. Then, he resumed cleaning. Across the park, volunteers for the parade were assembling booths and hanging ribbons on poles. No one noticed the man at the edge of the trees. Children practiced waving their flags. A high school brass band rehearsed near the fountain, their off-key notes trailing on the wind like startled birds. The smell of popcorn machines and corn dogs was beginning to carry on the breeze. And still, Harold scrubbed. At 7:42 a.m., a group of teenagers cut through the grass on the way to the main stage. They laughed as they tossed an empty soda can between them, their footsteps careless and loud. One of them kicked the can too far. It clattered across the pavement and rolled to a stop beside Harold's foot. He did not flinch. He picked up the can, placed it gently beside his bucket, and resumed his work. The teens barely noticed him. One muttered something that sounded like "old weirdo," and they disappeared around the hedges. Harold didn't react. His shoulders, slightly stooped with age, rose and fell as he exhaled. His fingers moved more slowly than they used to, but the pattern was familiar: wet cloth, small brush, circular motion, pause. He had done this nearly every Sunday since 1991. It had outlasted every job he held, every friend he'd buried, every medical appointment he'd postponed. By the time the first parade car reached the city's edge, Harold had moved on to the fifth stone. His knees ached from kneeling, but he said nothing. Pain had long ago become part of the rhythm. A distant drumbeat began. Trumpets found their pitch. The parade had started. A line of vintage cars and fire trucks crept along the route. Behind them, rows of cadets marched in formation, followed by the local ROTC, then a caravan of civic leaders and local veterans. Parents lined the sidewalks with lawn chairs, holding toddlers on their laps. Cheerleaders danced in coordinated steps while throwing candy into the crowd. School mascots posed for selfies. At the back of the procession rode a military jeep with General Ray Brigham, retired, but still called General by everyone in town. He was the parade's Grand Marshal this year. It was a ceremonial role, meant to honor his decades of service, but also because the city hoped his presence would remind people of shared sacrifice, something larger than politics or potholes. The parade turned the corner toward the park. The sound of music, drums, and engines began to echo against the trees, bouncing through the otherwise quiet corners of the park. A loudspeaker announced the approach of the final stretch. But then something changed. From his perch in the lead jeep, General Brigham saw something the crowd didn't. At the end of the tree-lined path, just before the marching band was to make its final turn, a single figure was kneeling, elderly, unmoving, head bowed over a stone. The general leaned forward. "Stop," he said to the driver. The jeep slowed. "Full stop," he repeated. Behind him, confusion rippled down the line. The drum line faltered. Brass instruments quieted. Dancers turned their heads. The mayor, seated 3 vehicles back, stood to see what the holdup was. The general climbed down from the jeep, his knees stiff, his boots thudding against the pavement. He walked toward the kneeling man. The sound of footsteps on gravel, soft and steady, was all that could be heard now. Harold had not noticed any of it. His rag traced the edges of a name, and his lips moved in soundless prayer. He was alone, as always. Until he wasn't. The general reached him and stopped. And for the first time in the parade, the crowd, the whole town, really fell into a hush. A single man, kneeling with a toothbrush and a bucket, had unknowingly halted a city's celebration. And no one yet understood why. A strange silence fell across the park, not the awkward kind that follows a misstep, but the reverent kind that comes when something sacred is unfolding. It was the kind of silence that made birds pause mid-call, that seemed to still the leaves in the trees. The crowd, which just moments before had been a blur of flags and candy and laughter, had frozen in place. Something unseen was holding their breath for them. General Brigham stood a few feet behind the kneeling figure. He recognized the posture, the set of the shoulders, the bowed head, the quiet precision in the way the rag moved across stone. It wasn't just respect. It was grief in its purest form, undisturbed by time. The general didn't speak. He didn't need to. He raised his right hand and came to attention. Behind him, the rows of soldiers still standing in formation noticed his gesture. One by one, as if carried by a wave, each soldier raised their hand in salute, first the front row, then the next, then the next. No command had been given, but in the heart of anyone who had worn the uniform, it was clear what needed to be done. Still, Harold didn't look up. His hand moved slowly, brushing away debris from the lettering on a small stone that sat lower than the rest. It had always bothered him, the way the city laid this one slightly off to the side, as if the sacrifice it marked had been somehow less. He had promised himself, long ago, that he would always start and end with this stone. That it would not be forgotten. A soft wind rustled the trees overhead. Somewhere nearby, a child whispered, but was gently hushed. The reverence was spreading, as if the entire crowd had been let in on a secret they didn't fully understand, but knew better than to interrupt. From the main street, the last rows of the parade slowed to a halt. Local business owners looked around, puzzled at first. Parents hoisted children onto their shoulders for a better view. A drone camera, operated by a local news outlet, hovered above and captured the image now forming, an old man in a denim jacket kneeling before a forgotten monument, and behind him, rows of soldiers, veterans, citizens, and children, all standing in silent recognition. It was the moment when something ordinary became sacred. The mayor, still dressed in his dark sash and holding a folder of pre-written speeches, stepped down from the float and removed his cap. He looked at the scene and said nothing. For once, the politician had no words. He simply stood alongside others, head bowed. The news camera's image began streaming live. Social media feeds across the city picked it up first, then regional outlets. The caption, written hastily by a college intern, read, "Parade stalls as war vet honors the fallen, silence sweeps Harrisville." In homes and offices and classrooms, the image was shared without commentary. It didn't need any. Back at the front, General Brigham took one step forward and lowered his hand. He waited, his shadow falling over Harold. A moment passed. Then another. Finally, Harold looked up. For a second, his face revealed no reaction, only calm focus. Then his eyes met the general's, and something unspoken passed between them. Not recognition of celebrity or awe, but something older, deeper, the shared language of service and memory. Harold struggled to rise, pushing off the ground with effort. His knees protested. The rag fell from his fingers. The general extended a hand. Harold hesitated. Not from pride, but because for so long no one had reached toward him. Not really. Then, quietly, he accepted the help. The crowd still did not speak. In that moment, the general stood tall beside the man with the bucket and the rag. He turned, slowly, to face the gathered crowd, now stretching all the way to the main street. He gave no speech. Instead, he saluted once more, this time with deliberate slowness, and turned back toward the stone Harold had just cleaned. He read the name. His lips moved, and though no one heard the words, they knew what he had done. Harold stood quietly, now beside the man who had once commanded battalions. He didn't smile. He didn't wave. He simply watched, quietly, as dozens of cadets and veterans followed the general's example, walking forward, one at a time, to place a hand on a stone, or to kneel briefly in respect. The path through the parade had become a path of remembrance. And though Harold had scrubbed those stones alone for over 30 years, this morning he was not alone. He stepped back slowly, picked up his bucket, and walked to the next stone. He knelt again, though his knees groaned louder than before. The general remained by his side, lowering himself onto one knee with the same reverence. Others followed. The parade never resumed. There was no music. No banners waved. No planned speeches were delivered. And yet, no one left. The celebration had changed form. What was meant to honor unity found a truer symbol than anyone had expected, a bent figure in denim, with a cloth and a toothbrush, showing the city what it had forgotten to remember. And no one who witnessed it would ever forget again. By mid-afternoon, the park had taken on the hush of a church sanctuary. Vendors who had set up corn dog stands and lemonade booths quietly closed them. Children were no longer asking for balloons or face paint. They were standing with their parents, some holding small American flags, others just watching the silent ritual unfold. What had begun as an interruption had become something far more profound, a collective unspooling of reverence the town didn't know it still carried. Harold continued working, stone by stone. He didn't change pace. He didn't smile. The only difference now was the number of hands that began to mirror his own. Someone had brought an extra bucket. Another person handed out cloths. By the time the sun had reached its highest point in the sky, nearly a dozen people knelt beside him, scrubbing in silence. General Brigham never left his side. He did not treat Harold like a guest or spectacle, only as a peer. Occasionally, he glanced toward a stone, paused, then resumed his own quiet cleaning. He offered no directives, and no one asked for any. Near the edge of the crowd, a teenage boy in a ROTC uniform stood with his mother. His name tag read Ramirez. His mother clutched her phone to her chest but didn't record. Instead, she leaned down and whispered, "That's what service looks like." The boy didn't answer. He didn't need to. He'd already stepped forward. Among the crowd, a few people murmured names aloud, not loudly, not theatrically, but as if trying to reawaken someone. The stones were coming alive again. Not with fanfare, but with memory. For the first time in years, they were being read, not just passed by. Near the edge of the crowd, a local journalist from Harrisville Public Radio stood with a microphone but didn't speak into it. She lowered her hand, turned off the recorder, and simply watched. She would write about it later, she decided. But for now, this belonged to the moment, not to media, not to headlines. Across the town, in living rooms and hospital beds, in high school libraries and nursing homes, the image of Harold had become impossible to ignore. That one photograph, the old man kneeling with the toothbrush while a general stood at attention behind him, was shared thousands of times within hours. Strangers were moved to tears. Veterans reached for their medals. Young people paused their scrolling. It wasn't the spectacle that moved them. It was the simplicity. No words. No requests. Just an act of remembrance so consistent, so quiet, that it could no longer go unseen. At City Hall, the mayor had received hundreds of calls by evening. Most simply asked, "Who is he?" Others asked if they could visit the stones, or how to help. Someone offered to print proper plaques. A retired teacher asked if her students could write biographies of the names on the markers. The local florist donated 20 wreaths. A church group delivered kneeling pads and water bottles. An elementary school teacher brought her students to trace names on paper with charcoal. None of this had been planned. None of it had been asked for. But somehow, every act felt right. That evening, as the sun began to lower behind the trees, Harold finally sat down on a small wooden bench near the end of the trail. He didn't look tired. Only still. His bucket sat beside him, half full. The rag hung over the rim like a flag at rest. A little girl approached, holding a clean cloth folded in her hand. Her father followed behind, unsure whether to interrupt. Harold looked at the cloth, then up at her. She offered it without a word. He accepted it with a nod. Then she sat beside him. Just sat. As if she'd understood something without needing to be told. Around them, dozens more stayed. Some walked the path slowly, reading names they had never seen before. Some knelt. Some prayed. No one raised their voice. It had become what it was always meant to be, a place of witness. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang 6 times. Harold rose once more, walked to the final stone at the trail's end, the one he always saved for last. It had cracked slightly in the last winter storm, a fissure running through the middle. He brushed a thumb over the name, then wiped the moss from its lower edge. He stood for several minutes, unmoving. Not in grief, but in presence. He had once believed no one would notice if he stopped coming. Now, he realized, even if he never came again, the work would continue. He turned slowly, ready to leave, but found that a small path had formed. People stood aside to make room. Not to honor a parade marshal. Not for a hero in uniform. But for a man with a rag and a memory. He passed the general, who gave a final salute, a slower one this time, palm trembling ever so slightly. Then Harold stepped beyond the stones, into the fading warmth of evening. He said nothing. But the silence behind him carried more than any ovation. He had done this for decades in solitude. Now, he walked away in the company of a town that would never forget him. The days that followed were unlike anything Harrisville had ever seen. No formal announcement was made. No committee convened. But still, each Sunday morning, people began to arrive at the edge of Memory Walk, families, veterans, teenagers, city workers. Some brought buckets. Some brought brushes. Some brought nothing but their presence. They came not to be seen, but to take part. The park's maintenance crew, previously assigned elsewhere, now volunteered for the Sunday shift. The rusted benches were repainted. Grass that had grown wild for years was trimmed by hand. New gravel was poured between the stones so that wheelchairs and walkers could pass with dignity. Someone donated wooden signs engraved with the names of each fallen soldier. Others brought laminated copies of letters home from war, photos and plastic sleeves, even medals returned by families who had no one else to pass them to. They lined the edges of the trail, each small tribute adding to a patchwork of remembrance. On the City Council's agenda that Monday, an item was added with little debate, Resolution 11-04, to rename the Memory Walk. It passed without a single dissenting vote. From that day forward, it would be known as Mason on a Trail. But Harold Mason never asked for the change. He never even attended the meeting. When asked for comment by the local paper, he declined the interview. He didn't return messages left by journalists from across the state. One television crew drove to the trailer park on the outskirts of town. He never answered the door. They left politely after a neighbor said, "If you're here for a story, you've already missed it." He wasn't looking to be honored. He was simply relieved that the names were finally being remembered by someone other than him. In the following weeks, a group of high school students formed a volunteer team called the Namekeepers. They researched every stone, piecing together military records and family trees, then compiled a digital archive. QR codes were installed beside each plaque, leading visitors to stories of bravery, loss, and sacrifice. Veterans from neighboring towns came to walk the trail in silence. A former Marine brought his granddaughter to clean the stone of a man he'd served with. A retired Army nurse laid a single red rose beside the marker of a medic she hadn't spoken of in decades. And every Sunday, without fail, Harold still came. He arrived early, before the crowds. His knees ached more. His breath came slower. But his hands still moved with care. When he couldn't kneel, someone brought him a custom-built stool with his initials carved into the side. He never asked who had made it. By his 80th birthday, the trail had become a pilgrimage site. Not for tourists or history buffs, but for people who needed to remember someone, or to be reminded that someone still cared. That morning, Harold found something waiting at each stone, a folded cloth, neatly tied with ribbon, and a handwritten note. The notes weren't addressed to him by name. Most simply said thank you, or we remember because you remembered. When he reached the final marker, there was no applause, no camera crew, no podium. Just a group of children, knees stained from grass, hands smudged with soil, gathered in a circle, cleaning in rhythm. Harold watched them for a long moment before joining in. He did not offer advice. He did not instruct. He simply sat beside them and began to scrub. As the years passed, Harold came less often. Winter made the trail harder to navigate. Breathing required more effort. But even when he could no longer visit, someone always arrived in his place, a young veteran, a widow, a child. On the second Sunday of the following spring, Harold's trailer door remained closed. A neighbor knocked gently, then again. There was no answer. Later that afternoon, a small black ribbon appeared on the trail's entrance sign. No announcement was made. But word spread. The next Sunday, more than 500 people arrived in silence. Some carried flags. Some brought their children. Most carried nothing but the knowledge of what he had done. A brass bugler stood at the center of the trail and played taps. No speech followed. No formal memorial was held. That had never been Harold's way. Instead, the cleaning began, stone by stone, cloth by cloth. Just as he had done. The stool he once used was placed near the first marker. A plaque was affixed beneath it. It read simply, "He asked for nothing. He gave us memory." And beside it, engraved into stone, Harold Mason, 1944 to 2024. U.S. Army veteran. Namekeeper. Friend. Teacher of quiet honor. Today, the trail still fills each Sunday. People come from other cities, even other states. They come not to grieve, but to give. Children learn history not from textbooks, but from tracing the names of those who served. Teenagers who once sneered at remembrance now carry buckets with purpose. Veterans find peace among others who understand. And the sound that fills the trail isn't music or applause, it is the gentle rhythm of cloth against stone. The kind of sound that says, someone is still remembered. Harold never sought recognition. He never raised his voice. He never demanded change. He simply knelt down, week after week, and reminded the world that no name should fade from memory. And in doing so, he became a memorial all his own. Kindness without question is enough.